When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
So, a lot of people are really grateful to be able to sing a song like that these days. A lot of people find it hard to sing a song like that these days, and a lot of people can't even think of singing a song like that these days. So, how's your soul? How's your soul? This week, I reconnected with an old friend who helps me wrestle with my answers to those questions. He got me to do something I've never done before. 4 days before the start of a new Sunday series I had studied and thought and prayed about for months, I put the study on hold because I believe Habakkuk holds a lot of questions and a lot of answers about a lot of things a lot of people are wrestling with right now. Over the years, I've tried to get to know Habakkuk, and I've learned a lot from him. As with anything in the Bible, I still have a lot to learn. Last week, I dug out my old notes and I started digging into some new books about him, and I read the words he wrote that we have in our Bibles. I read them over and over and over again. And they often look like a summary of news headlines these days, as seen through the eyes of a man at a place in his journey where he was able to be open and honest with God about what he was thinking and what he was feeling. Time after time, God responded openly and honestly. So we're going to spend a few weeks together with Habakkuk and God. And as much as anything, I believe it will show that God and the Bible are as relevant as ever. God and the Bible have a lot of things to say right now. Now, if you know me at all, uh, you probably heard me call myself a bookaholic. A lot of that comes from being what I call a learnaholic. I have been chronically curious for as long as I can remember. I've often been guilty of driving people crazy with questions. I had all kinds of questions after I stumbled into a church for the first time as a young adult. One of my favorite Bible teachers often says the only dumb question is the one you don't ask. And I asked a lot of questions when I started going to my first weekly Bible study. I'm pretty sure asking questions, or at least as many as I did and the kinds I did, wasn't always appreciated by the leaders. But a lot of the young adults would pull me aside and whisper, "I'm glad you're here because you ask questions we're too afraid to ask." And what we have from Habakkuk is only 3 chapters long, but those chapters are full of question marks. I feel like my friends from that Bible study, man, I'm glad he's here because he asks a lot of questions a lot of people seem afraid to ask. I mean, just look at the first couple of lines from what is basically the man's diary. Lord, I continue to ask for help. How long will you ignore me? How long must I beg for your help before you listen? Now, look at these lines that follow. Why do you allow violence, lawlessness, crime, and cruelty to spread everywhere? I cried to you about the violence, but you did nothing. People are stealing things and hurting others. They're arguing and fighting. Criminals crowd out honest people and they twist the laws around. Evil people gain while good people lose. The judges no longer make fair decisions. Why do you make me look at these terrible things? Now, before we start getting into those words, I want to look at the kinds of things that were going on in his world to get him to a place of such transparent desperation with God. And to understand what he was wrestling with, we need to look at some history. And I know that gets a few of you excited, and I lost a few of you just by mentioning we're going to look at some history. Thing is, one of the many challenges I find with the Bible comes from how much time can be covered by just turning a few pages. For example, over 500 years passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph to the Israelites suffering as slaves under the Egyptians. And that was when Moses appeared on the scene to lead them into the promised land. Then another 500 years passed before David became a key figure in the history of the Israelites and of the whole world. And it seems most people think of what is in the Bible as being apart from history when it actually covers many significant parts of history. It's not apart from history, it's a part of history. So more than 1,000 years passed between the time Abraham heard God tell him that he was going to build a special nation through him, and when the nation really began to take shape under King David. 1,000 years. After years of the Israelites wandering all over the place, David wanted to build a temple, like a permanent place for and a focal point of worship of this God. Now, David was an amazing general, leader, king, and man, but he still messed up a lot. And he messed up so badly at one point, God told him he was not going to be the one who would build the temple. That would be up to David's son, Solomon. And you may be wondering what any of this has to do with Habakkuk, patience. This history plays a huge part in the brutally honest questions Habakkuk later put to God. Now, with the borders in place for Israel and the temple done, the people of Israel finally hit a point of relative peace and even prosperity for a time. But then King Solomon died, and things began going downhill quickly for the Israelites. Disagreements between Solomon's sons turned into disputes, which turned into heated conflicts that ended up splitting the nation of Israel in two. What was known as the New Israel was made up of 2 tribes in the north. Another 10 tribes stayed in the south. That was known as Judah. It was also known as Jerusalem because that key city was the center of Judah. Now, Israel in the north was pretty weak, pretty defenseless. And it didn't take much for the Babylonians to take it over and lead most of the northern Israelites into exile, which left Judah all alone, very vulnerable in the military sense, and in a moral sense, and in a spiritual sense. And whether in the north or the south or in exile, the people, the Israelites, began to forget God, and a series of dumb and or dangerous kings filled the land with sites and temples to a whole bunch of other gods. And this is just an example of how bad things got. King Manasseh also murdered many innocent people until Jerusalem was filled from one end to the other with innocent blood. Well, then Manasseh's son, a man named Ammon, took over, and he abandoned the Lord, the God of his ancestors. And he refused to allow the people to follow the Lord, and he refused to follow the Lord's ways. Then Ammon's own officials conspired against him and assassinated him in his palace. The people of the land killed all those who had conspired against King Ammon, and they made his son Josiah the next king. That gives just a little picture of just how horrible things were in divided Israel. Can you even imagine what it would have been like to be Josiah, named the leader of this mess? Now, what if I added one other detail? Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. And I know sisters of 8-year-old brothers tend to be uniquely shocked by that verse. Josiah was 8 when he became king. Now, the Bible jumps from there to him at 26, and he was overseeing some major work on the temple. After years of neglect and misuse and theft, it was in terrible shape. And Josiah ordered extensive cleaning and reconstruction. As that was going on, the high priest found some long forgotten scrolls. A wide variety of historians, those who believe in the Bible, as well as many who don't, believe it was the first 5 books of what we have in our Bibles. Well, Josiah and the high priest began going through those scrolls. And as they read, they started weeping, and they kept weeping, seeing all the ways the people, had turned from God and the effect that had been having. And Josiah called people from all over the nation to come and to hear it read out loud. They put translators all throughout the people, and translators who could help put it into a language they could understand, and even words in their own language that they could understand. Individuals, along with entire institutions, committed themselves to return to God and his ways. I mean, look at this part of the report. Never had there been a king like Josiah, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength. Now, as awesome as that is, we need to keep it in perspective. That was in Judah. It was globally insignificant, especially compared to the 3 world powers at the time. I mean, think in terms of, say, Arkansas up against the rest of the United States, China, and Japan. At that time, there was Assyria. Assyria had been the main power, but was on its way down quickly. Egypt had been a major player for a long time, but was also in a pretty steady, slow decline. In sharp contrast, there were the Babylonians. They were brutally violent and they were on the rise. Well, Egypt's leader sent a letter to King Josiah telling him he wanted to take his army through Judah and up into Assyria. The Egyptian leader figured that if he was going to have any chance against the Babylonians, he would need to go and beat the Assyrians and pull them together to fight Babylon. Well, Josiah said no, he would not allow the Egyptians to pass through on the way to Assyria. The Egyptian army rolled through Judah anyway. Josiah and his forces tried to fight back, but that was pointless, and Josiah was killed in battle. Then a series of his sons made their way to the throne, where they showed themselves to be fools. And all the good Josiah had done was completely undone. And on top of that, Judah was caught in the middle of battles between the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and a variety of other smaller guerrilla groups, basically, that started to spread up all around that area. Now, that finally brings us to Habakkuk. What we have from him came from the middle of all that brutal chaos. It's weird. All we know about him is his name, really. There isn't any mention of anyone in his family. There isn't anything said about what he did for a living, how old he was. There's nothing about him. We just know him as a prophet because that's what he called himself in the opening line. Now, the Bible has books from 17 prophets. 5 of them are called major prophets, and 12 of them are called minor prophets. Habakkuk is a minor prophet, but that doesn't have anything to do with importance or significance. It just has to do with length. In this case, 3 chapters, 56 verses. And it's basically an open dialogue between a confused and desperate person and God. Actually, it's more than a dialogue. Unlike any of the other 65 books and letters that make up the Bible, Habakkuk comes out swinging at God. Earlier, I showed how a few modern Bible versions had his opening words. If you summarize what he said, he basically kept asking God, what in the world is going on and why? Now, his actual words were probably harsher than that, but we need to keep a G rating. But this study is for those of us who have or have had hard questions we would like to ask God about hard things going on, things personally, things locally, things nationally, and even things globally. But this study is also for people who have peace amidst the things that are going on. Remember, Paul the Apostle wrote about how the whole body suffers when just one part suffers. If you don't believe that, you've likely never bashed your baby toe on a piece of furniture in the dark in the middle of the night. Healthy parts of the body are to keep learning how to come alongside hurting parts of the body. And I believe that's what Habakkuk has done here. And I believe coming alongside of him, allowing him to come alongside of us, can bring us into a really important place in our relationships with God. Now, most English Bibles begin Habakkuk with him calling what he wrote an oracle or a message. If you look at the Old King James Bible, it uses the word burden. Habakkuk says, "This is a burden I have written." It was like he was saying, these are some things that are weighing really heavily on my heart, my mind, and my soul. And he got right into it, didn't hold anything back right from the very beginning. Again, look at the sampling of Bible versions that I used earlier of how Habakkuk opened his honest, transparent dialogue with God, and try to get your mind around this was 2,600 years ago. But the Bible itself calls itself living and active. Lord, I continue to ask for help. How long will you ignore me? How long must I beg for your help before you listen? Why do you allow violence, lawlessness, crime, and cruelty to spread everywhere? I cried to you about the violence, but you did nothing. People are stealing things and hurting others. They're arguing and fighting, and criminals are crowding out honest people, and they're twisting the laws. Evil people gain while good people lose. The judges no longer make fair decisions. Why do you make me look at these terrible things? Because of the way my brain is wired, I ask a lot of questions like that. As a pastor, I hear a lot of questions like that. Emotional questions people have for God and questions people have about God. People don't typically ask for time with me to talk about how great things are with them and God and how He is making perfect sense to them. I believe pretty much everyone hits places where we ask, I mean, in our minds, if we don't feel safe to ask them out loud, we ask things like, God, what in the world are you doing? If you are loving, if you are good, how can this be happening? Or if you're all powerful, why didn't you make that happen? Or why didn't you keep that from happening? I hear versions of those questions all the time. And those kinds of questions are just as common among people inside the church as they are outside. And I believe stifling those kinds of questions for too long can be a factor in the kinds of things we've been seeing and hearing out there over the past couple of weeks. Hard things held inside for too long almost always burst, and exploding thoughts and emotions can be very contagious. Well, Habakkuk had grown tired of keeping those kinds of questions in, and he was confused, and he was frustrated, and he even seems to have been angry. It's as though Habakkuk got specific with something the great warrior King David wrote while he was hiding in a cave. I pour out my complaints on Facebook. I tweet my complaints. I pour out my complaints on Instagram. I pour out. No, no. If you can't see the verse on your screen, I need to say it out loud for you. King David wrote, I pour out my complaints before God. That's a summary statement of what Habakkuk did 2,600 years ago. I know some people believe there is something wrong with that we should never question, never doubt, never disagree with God. Now, I believe if that were true, we would need to tear a lot of the Psalms out of our Bibles. We would have to rip out a lot of Habakkuk. And by the way, did you know founding father Thomas Jefferson did that? He did that very thing. He literally took a razor and scissors and cut out big parts of the New Testament that he didn't agree with or he didn't like. But these questions are here. These questions, these emotions, this frustration is here to lead us, to guide us, to help us learn. And it's full, Habakkuk is full of question marks, but he moves to one huge exclamation mark. We will get to the exclamation mark. But I believe if we don't spend the right kind of time with the questions, we won't be as amazed as we should be by the answers. And I believe finding safety and freedom and even finding welcome to ask God our deepest, hardest questions will go a long way in helping us see how real and how close God really is, and how deeply He cares, and how madly He wants to hear from us. And I'm looking forward to exploring that through Habakkuk in the weeks ahead.